James, your book Lost Boys has been published recently. Tell us a little bit about what it explores and what the reception to it has been.
Yeah, so Lost Boys: A Personal Journey Through the Manosphere. It's published in June. It's basically the fruit of like 5 years a 5 year investigation into the Manosphere. Lots of like embedded stuff, like me going to America and hanging around a bunch of these various groups like pickup artists, so-called like red pill groups, people who basically are very anti-feminist and see all of the world's problems as caused by feminism, and also kind of people who go on photo shoots in Las Vegas with Lamborghinis trying to maximize their status for social media. Yeah, I mean it was a long process, and yeah, the book's just come out.
What is the Manosphere for people who don't know it?
So the Manosphere is basically a group of anti-feminist subcultures, mainly on the internet, but they also have courses, boot camps, and programs in the offline world as well.
Your book tracks a personal journey over 5 years. It starts with like the pickup artist communities. It then tracks how that merged into the red pill movement, the incels, and then essentially why a considerable number of young men today believe there's a global feminist conspiracy around the world, which is threatening their status. Can you explain a bit about that evolution and what are the key points along that way?
So essentially, the pickup artists emerge really in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, there are kind of proto pickup artists existing in the 1980s and the late 1970s even, but the community really comes together on some of the internet forums in the 90s and 2000s. Some of it's relatively benign. Some of it's just guys sharing tips on kind of what aftershave to wear on a date, how to, where to take someone on a date, some of this stuff. But there's always this quite dark side of which is kind of based in misogyny, which is kind of how to manipulate women into bed. And also they have a very old-fashioned like taxonomy of the world and gender relations. So they view men and women as two basically like distinct entities. Like what is that book? Men are from Mars, women are from Venus, etc. And yeah, I mean that community really explodes with Neil Strauss, the journalist's book in 2005, The Game, which sells like 2 million copies. I think it's on the New York Times bestseller list for around 2 months. And the community after that, there are all of these kind of pickup entrepreneurs which emerge, and that kind of world reaches kind of a cultural high point, I would say, in the late 2000s. Probably like 2008, 9, 10 is kind of, that's a multi-million-dollar industry, pickup artists around running programs in cities around the world. But in the 2010s, you start to see like a backlash towards that community, not just from women and feminists, but also from men who feel like they've been ripped off and scammed by some of those kind of entrepreneurs in that world, as it were. And they start to, that's what becomes the incel community, the part of that anti-pickup artist backlash. And then you see another group of men who kind of got their stripes, as it were, in that community. Like they went through the community. And then they kind of break away from the pickup and game stuff and forge kind of a much more political kind of anti-feminist movement, which is then called the Red Pill.
Because if I've got this right, the pickup artists, even though there was undoubtedly misogyny running through what they were trying to impart on people, they weren't blaming women for not wanting men. They were just sort of saying, if you treat women a bit badly and make them want you and play these sort of mysterious, enigmatic games and use this psychology, women will be more drawn towards you. But it wasn't saying that there was something about the women themselves who only wanted a certain type of man.
Yeah, I mean, there was a bit of that. I mean, to the extent that they said, you need to mold yourself into this certain type of man. You need to develop these certain, what they would say, alpha male characteristics in order for women to like you, because women only like these types of men. But there wasn't really, it was always, at least from the material I was reading when I was like 22, 23, it was always like, it was always your fault. It's never the woman's fault. So it's like, you need to develop these traits, and that like stop moaning about like what women like. You just need to like get with the program and develop these kind of traits. I mean, it was manipulative, and there were always these like very essentialist views of like men and women. But there was also this tendency of, it's always your fault. It's not hers. So kind of the responsibility was with you to change, and it tended to be men berating other men and telling them how they needed to change their entire personality to be an alpha male. Whereas it wasn't. It was like, if you hate women, if you actively hate women, that's bad, because that will mean that women aren't interested in you. You know, that's bad for your game, so to speak. So you should actually develop a healthy view of women, at least to an extent. That was what they said. So I mean, it was bad, but it wasn't as bad as what came after, I would say.
And a lot of people, with the release of your book, have been really interested in your personal journey, which you write about in the sort of early days of the pickup community. I mean, what were your insights about the types of people who were being attracted to that world, what they wanted to achieve, and then contrasting that with, later on in the book, you go to Las Vegas and you go to, you know, American conventions where sort of a lot of misogynists gather, and sort of what distinguishes the types of people that were attracted to it and are increasingly going towards that more as an ideology.
So all of these movements are of their time. So the pickup scene, as I found it, and as existed in the late 90s, 2000s, it was, you know, aside from the gurus who were like making money and profiting from that stuff, you had basically a lot of the guys were like fairly socially awkward, didn't really know how to navigate this kind of post-sexual revolution, post-feminist like world or whatever, where, you know, their parents and grandparents, it had been very, you know, rigid how you go about kind of meeting someone, taking them on a date, and then you tend to get married quite young and have kids, then happily ever after, supposedly. But it was a sort of generational thing where you had guys who were just trying to navigate the new world of kind of, you know, liberated women or whatever, and didn't know how to go about that. You know, are we supposed to still be assertive? And there was like confusion around gender roles and stuff. That was kind of the benign side of it. And I did meet a lot of guys, and I'd include myself in that, like young guys as well, who were just kind of didn't know how to bridge the gap in terms of being social with other people, were just kind of socially awkward, came from backgrounds where there was a lot of engineer guys attracted to it, who saw everything through like a problem-solving context and wanted to kind of treat their dating life in the same way. But yeah, so, and it was of its time also in the sense that you had these kind of women making progress in kind of the boardroom and the bedroom, if you like, the home. And there was a bit of always an element of it that was a backlash against that. There was men like, oh, men need to be back in the saddle. And there was always that kind of dark side to that community. Like, oh, men have just been like, they would say like men have been pussified by like political correctness and feminism, and men need to learn how to assert themselves again. And you shouldn't be afraid of your desires as a man and all of this stuff. So it was of its time. It was like part of a backlash, partly men navigating this new world. Whereas the movement that came after it was more politicized, the red pill movement, that coincided with things like the rise of Donald Trump. So you see kind of this enmeshing of the red pill movement and the MAGA movement in like 2015, 16.
That's fascinating in your book, by the way. When I read it, the section about that and Gamergate, which maybe you can explain as well, how that was very much an embryo for what came afterwards, and Steve Bannon himself saying something along the lines of, you get them in through Gamergate and then you channel them into politics. But
yeah, and
that's a really interesting part of it. Yeah,
in the 2010s you have kind of the emergence of like YouTube is a very important platform for some of these communities. So you have like the pickup artist movement starts, originally it's like forums and email newsletters and stuff, which funnily enough are going back to that model of email newsletters now. But then it changed to kind of online video on YouTube. And what those pickup artist companies realized was the content they were producing, the content that got the most hits was, it wasn't content which was teaching men, giving men dating advice. It became about, belittling women, berating women, diminishing women, content that was kind of a bit more political, conspiratorial, where you'd have kind of guys filming themselves, even sometimes going out to nightclubs and just causing like a scene and stuff, and as entertainment. So the company started to entertain men rather than provide just kind of advice, and that started to lend itself to these more extreme videos, these more extreme characters like Julian Blanc, a pickup artist who was kind of the Time magazine called him the most hated man in the world in 2014 for kind of performing these misogynistic stunts on camera when he was in Japan. And you do see kind of this, the pickup artist community itself starts to get more extreme. And then you also have this more politicized, harder edged Red Pill movement, which is also a rejection of even the kind of compromise aspects of the pickup community. So it's like we have no truck whatsoever with feminism. Because the old pickup artists did used to say things like, oh, well, we agree with these parts of feminism, just not these parts. But then it became this just wholesale rejection of feminism, and they started to kind of basically argue that men's problems everything started to go wrong for men, and white men in particular, because of the feminist movement. So everything is kind of pinned on women for why everything started to go wrong. Why your job sucks, why your relationship sucks, everything is kind of pinned on that. And that sort of manifests in this hatred of politicians like Hillary Clinton, who's running against Donald Trump. It happens to be in 2016, where that is when it becomes much more political. And Steve Bannon, he basically sees some of this energy online, some of this kind of anti-feminist, anti-political correctness energy on these forums like Reddit, on 4chan. And he basically is like, how can we politicize this? How can we channel this into a political movement? And they hit, along with Milo Yiannopoulos, they basically started to do that through Gamergate, through the Breitbart news website. This kind of pushback against women's kind of movement towards equality, against more women in computer games, against representation in like boardrooms. They just pushed back against all of this, harnessing this kind of loser energy from the internet, basically.
And then Donald Trump was almost the perfect politician to embody all of that. Because of who he is and his entire history and his behavior towards women.
And also the spectacle with Trump. It's like there's he was very good at the kind of spectacle of like owning libs or women or feminists online. So he's very kind of clippable in that sense. So you'd have these clips that would emerge, that would be shared on websites. He's very memeable, where it would be like, oh, Trump slaps down like Rosie O'Donnell or something. And they love that stuff on these forums, because it's kind of, they're living vicariously through Donald Trump kind of slapping down these women who they see as the manifestation of everything that's, why their life sucks, because of these kind of professional Karens, as they would come to call them, who they feel all they do is scold people like them.
Yeah. And so how does that dovetail into the wider far-right ideology? Because, I mean, obviously it's very hierarchical. Patriarchy is at the heart of it. But, I mean, again, one of the really important takeaways, I think, from your book is situating what has become known as the Manosphere within the context of it's very much a part of, not separate to, or even just adjacent to, the wider global far-right movement that we're seeing in Western democracies, and a pushback on rights of many minorities, and predominantly women's rights as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly because there's always been, in like fascist politics, there's always been, especially if you look at kind of fascist politics, in the previous century, in Italy, for example, 20s and 30s, there's always been this obsession around like masculinist culture, around kind of male virility, male strength. And bodybuilding is you had a big kind of obsession with bodybuilding in Italy in the 20s and 30s, around that kind of aesthetic of male beauty. Also in Japan, fascist movements there. There's always been kind of, and in America too. So you have, in the US, you have these kind of tribalist type movements where it's all about like going out to the woods and like yodeling and standing around like roaring fires and chanting and being strong. And, there's these rituals kind of, ritualized like fighting of each other, initiation rituals. There's always been that element of far right movements
and
about
then you have, like
strength.
Vladimir Putin and his photo opportunities on riding horses or whatever else he's doing in the oceans, or
and riding like shirtless on horseback and stuff. But so there's always been kind of this like well of far right politics for those figures in the Manosphere to draw on. So you start to see like these conferences, one of which I went to, the Manosphere conference in Orlando every year, called the 21 Summit. And you start to see at these things more speakers that are drawn from that far right politics, because they're talking about the same subjects. People like Jack Donovan, who is constantly talking about masculinity, what it means to be a man, how men are, men need to be alpha again, and men need to kind of, he's got a book called like Violence is Golden. Men need to get back in touch with their kind of primal urges and stuff. And and some of the red pill manosphere, they see this stuff and like it resonates with them, and so they start getting invited into these manosphere spaces. And you just see over time gradual kind of cross-pollination. It becomes kind of much more infused with far-right politics, racialist themes, anti-Semitism as well, till it basically becomes the same kind of movement. And yeah, the conference I went to in 2022 was the last time I went to one of those red pill conferences at the end of 2022. You have people there trying to recruit for the next American Civil War, as they put it. I heard multiple instances of like anti-Semitism, racism, racist rhetoric, and you just see that like there isn't really a manosphere now that's separate from the far right. Really, it's kind of one and the same thing.
And when you interact with these people, is this something they really believe? Is it something they have been brainwashed into believing? To what extent? How do we explain why these people are drawn to this? Beyond, is it just individual grievance? Is it just people who are looking to feel better about themselves via status? Is it just people who are racist? How is it? What would you say, having seen these people up close and been around them? Like, what sense do you get of what's really behind all of this? Is it just a load of people jumping on a bandwagon because of grievance, or is it much more? They believe in this. It's much more ideological.
I mean, I could see some people who profit from it, some of the masculinity entrepreneurs, as it were. You can see some of them jumping on a bandwagon because they see that there's money to be made in this space through selling courses, through selling workout programs, and they jump on that opportunistically. But then at the same time, they can still be radicalized in the process. So they may jump on it opportunistically to begin with, and then radicalize themselves while putting out this content, consuming other similar content, spending lots of time in spaces where you have similar content creators or speakers or grifters, basically. But I mean, in terms of the kind of foot soldiers of the movement, like the men aren't just kind of monsters in the making. Like, men are not all like monsters in the making. It's not just like men who hate women. It's kind of, there's a radicalization process that goes on like any form of radicalization. Yeah, you have some people who already arrive at these subcultures with something in their background that predisposes them to this stuff. Maybe some incident or just some prejudicial views they already hold. But a lot of it's kind of a radicalization process, because I met guys in like 2018, 19, and then met the same people again in 2023. And some of those people were way more extreme over the course of that period of time during COVID, compared to when I first met them. So you do see radicalization. And sometimes some of that is like the stuff that's talked about a lot, like algorithms. Like they start consuming some content on, say, it can even be like Jordan Peterson or something, and then over time they get recommended videos by more extreme creators, and they start kind of going on platforms like Rumble because they heard of this Andrew Tate guy, and they start watching Rumble, and then they see other videos on there. The content creators that the left doesn't want you to hear. It has this kind of subversive element to it, and then just they get immersed in this kind of culture and start buying into various conspiracy theories. There isn't one reason why people get into it. That's the kind of, in some ways it's hard to explain. Like, it's a question, I can emphasize algorithms, I can emphasize kind of the structural things, like more men live at home with their parents than women in their 30s and 40s now. And it's not loads more, but it can make it harder to form relationships. And then they have these kind of content creators online saying that, the reason your life isn't how you hoped it would be is because women and minorities are hoarding all the treasure. It's kind of a classic populist trope, but it's definitely radicalization. It's like no one's similar with other kinds of prejudice. Like, no one is born hating another type of person. It's something that's kind of inculcated in them through the cultural waters they swim in, basically.
And in terms of those waters, I mean, we could spend a lot of time talking about Andrew Tate, who you cover in the book, more peripheral but still significant figures like Jordan Peterson. But how do you think these strains of thinking are seeping more into the mainstream beyond just people who identify as incels, red pillars in the manosphere, or as part of a more fascistic worldview. I mean, in which ways is this seeping into a broader cultural movement that affects obviously women, but also men, and how they are seeing themselves, and masculinity and vulnerability, which hardly really gets mentioned in any of this?
Yeah, I mean, the Netflix series Adolescence earlier this year. I mean, that went viral, if that's the right term for a Netflix series. But it was all over. It was kind of known all over. Became known all over the world. Like it was the thing that everyone was watching for a few weeks back in April, and that portrayed like kind of an apocalyptic scenario where a 13-year-old boy who's been immersed in misogynistic culture online, spoiler alert, murders his school classmate, a female in his school. And, there was a lot of there was almost a moral panic about the manosphere following that, because it's like, oh, is this what's going to happen in my school or to my kids or something? But that's not really, that there are instances of that. And I write about those cases in the book, but they're mercifully rare. That's not typically what's happening. It's much more subtle and insidious than that. So on the one hand, you have some of these manosphere ideas, these kind of noxious ideas about men's superiority over women creeping into relationships, manifesting in kind of controlling, coercive behavior. But also there's kind of concepts from the manosphere like meme their way into public consciousness, into the mainstream more subtly just through social media. So the 80-20 rule is kind of a manosphere meme. It's kind of probably the main manosphere trope. The idea that it's not even 80%. They say that all women are just interested in 20% of men. Sometimes that's 10% of men. They'll say just like a small minority of post the sexual revolution. Now that women can choose who they get with, they're only going to go after the small percentage of men. And even if you have a wife or a girlfriend, behind your back, she's going to be sliding in the DMs of, I don't know, Chris Hemsworth, Ryan Gosling, whatever it is, just some like elite man. And so basically it sows this sense of paranoia in order to sell courses. So it makes young men scared that...
And a lot of them, a significant amount of young men are believing this.
Yeah, so I think it was 53% of 16 to 24-year-old men, according to Ipsos, a poll done this year, believe this is true, believe that women are only interested in a small cohort of men. Also, 51% of the same age group think that feminism's gone too far and that women have the whip hand over men. I don't think that's the language that Ipsos used, but that's essentially, that's the gist of it. So you see some of these ideas seeping into the mainstream kind of without us realizing it in a way. So, sort of memeing themselves into the discourse online. They're not getting this information from BBC News or Trevor McDonald on ITV or whoever. They're getting it from social media, X, YouTube content creators, Rumble content creators, Reddit. I don't know if 4chan even still exists because it's a while since I was researching this stuff. But yeah, so it memes itself into the mainstream. And the whole trope is nonsense. It's based on a misreading of stats from dating apps. But it's also something that gurus in the manosphere propagate this fear narrative that, you don't want to be one of the surplus men. If you in 10 years, like just 10% of men are going to be like monopolizing all the women. So then they can come along and sell their courses and say, well, but I've got this course just for you, just for someone like you. And if you buy my course, this fate, you'll escape this fate and you'll be all right.
One of the parts of the book that's really interesting is one of the conventions in Nevada, I think, where part of what people have signed up for and paid for, I guess, is they're taken to the desert, I think, and they're allowed to pose with this really nice car, and then they spend you're there, aren't you, like helping them sort of set these photos up, and it's all about status and posing with an infinity pool or whatever it is. To what extent has that kind of Instagram culture and status, I mean, it's kind of an advanced status culture driven by the likes of social media, like how that's playing out more in the mainstream, just beyond the kind of manosphere movement. How do you think that is segueing into the kinds of things you're talking about with regards to men, masculinity, status, men caring about how they look, for example, physically?
So yeah, that ties into the best way to see the manosphere. So the manosphere, I mean, the way the manosphere is talked about often in like the mainstream is that you have like mainstream society, which has solved all of these problems around like women's equality, and then the manosphere over here, which is like the men who hate women, the bad people. Whereas it's not. The manosphere is an amplification of trends you see kind of in the mainstream to some extent. And it's the same with some of this kind of status maxing, as they would call it in Vegas, going out to the desert, having photo shoots with like rented Lambos, going to rented mansions and taking photos by the pool, and get your laptop out and it's like office for the day type captions on it, and private jets sat on the runway where you're going inside photo, then like straight out again, making out you're flying around like this. And it's innately comical in some ways, but it's also the people on doing this stuff don't see it that way. They take it very seriously. They've paid a lot of money to do these shoots, and partly that's because of the manosphere narrative about you can't just be ordinary anymore. You have to portray yourself. You have to make a social media footprint which portrays you as this like member of the elite, high status men. So that's part of it. But also mainstream society's become more, for want of a better word, more superficial as well. I think, since, Instagram and apps like Tinder, it's like basically a catalogue of flesh. Life is kind of online is kind of seen more and more as a series of monetizable content opportunities. And you're a brand, and your image is, you have to curate your image. And especially among younger people, men and women, there's much more pressure to curate the perfect image for social media, which is often where you spend most of your time. So you see this mainstream trend about it's more important to project an image of success and status. People do it in different ways on different platforms. On LinkedIn, it's like millions of people just posting how thrilled they are to be part of some, I don't know, management consultancy program or white collar boxing event or whatever. Whereas on Instagram, it's much cruder, more materialistic, more visual. So the manosphere is kind of amplifying trends that are already there, where it feels like you have to present yourself as living this kind of better lifestyle than everyone else. And also looks have become more of a status symbol. So I feel like this is something that's been true. This pressure has been exerted on women for a long time, where companies make women feel bad so they can sell them procedures and different things like perfumes or status symbols, whatever it is. But you see that pressure coming to bear on men, not necessarily as much, but to much more than in the past now, where there is more pressure. Companies have figured out, masculinity entrepreneurs have figured out that making men feel bad is, it may be something that people wring their hands about in the newspapers, but it helps you to shift product by making people feel bad so they buy your consumer thing. And when it comes to the manosphere, they're kind of pioneers in that, making men feel bad to sell them the course or program or boot camp.
It feels a bit like all of these issues, because mental health is another one, which again has been discussed in the context of social media. Fairly often we're talking about what that's doing to especially young girls, for example, on Instagram. Obviously, I think in a different way it also applies to men. But again, that mental health aspect, I mean, what you're talking about is where people are being encouraged to get their sense of self-worth and their sense of esteem. And I mean, is that one of the challenges when thinking about how to tackle something like the manosphere, that actually it's not just about the manosphere or mental health or social media or a more sort of superficial society where we're all encouraged to be brands and that sort of consumerist world, which has just kind of exploded in a different way now with tech. These things are really all pieces of the puzzle that all need to be addressed because they're all impacting each other. I mean, I'm sure there are things you can specifically do to educate young men in schools with regards to things about, women's rights, harmful misogyny, harmful ideology. But it seems to be just, that shouldn't be done in a silo. It seems like all these other things are relevant as well.
Yeah, and that's the difficulty with, so when I do talks about the book, or when people ask me about the book, they're often like, so what do we do? And it's like, yeah, there are those kind of things you can do, like, ban phones in schools, social media in schools or something. But it's like we also kind of exist in this much bigger ecosystem where these pressures are being exerted. And it's like, I don't really know, like, what's the answer to kind of Instagram capitalism, where everyone feels like they're in this, huge, like, one big economy of resentment, where everyone feels like they're kind of constantly exposed to people who have more than them, people who are living a better life, people who are having more sex, people who are living a more luxurious life. Like, what's my answer to that? I don't know. It's like, that's just something that's like a technological thing, something that's changed in the culture, where there is just more resentment now because we're constantly exposed to what we don't have more. I'm a writer, John Gantz, who I like a lot, his stuff. He talked about how he's written about how social media has kind of universalized feelings of pauperization. So you even see rich people like Elon Musk, if he's still the richest man in the world, I think, on social media, like, driven by this resentment that he's not respected in the way he feels he should be by kind of cultural institutions, the cultural hierarchies, or whatever. It just feels like, and even with, like, we have these protests going on in Epping right now, you have a bunch of people, more and more people in the country, it seems, who their whole kind of worldview is driven by the fact that they see some people on boats, some people, vulnerable people coming from war zones, who might be getting a slightly bigger handout from the government than they are, often based on no evidence. But everything's just kind of is driven by resentment now, in politics, and the Manosphere is like that. It's this constantly being bombarded with the sense that you're not enough, and other people have more than you. And the depressing part is there's so many people have a financial interest in perpetuating that narrative as well, to as mentioned before, sell product to these people who are in this, whether it's political entrepreneurs to sell a certain agenda off the back of that, or whether it's Manosphere influencers to sell their kind of $10,000 courses to these men who are just in their basements terrified because they think that everyone else is having more fun than they are.
It's interesting you mention the protests and the small boats, because obviously when Keir Starmer made this speech about the risk of the UK becoming an island of strangers, which he says he now regrets, quite a few people were like, that is true, but not in the way he intended, because actually there is a deep alienation and disconnect in many aspects of society that people are feeling, but it's not really talked about in that language. And I guess social media is playing into that. But, a lot of what you're describing is there's real alienation, isn't there? Like, people feeling alone, resentful. There has to be someone to blame for why my situation is as dire as it is, not just perhaps materially in terms of my income or my prospects, but also just I'm sat here still living with my parents on my own, disengaged. It is interesting the extent to which, as you say, a lot of this is finding it's a psychological and a more visceral sense of grievance, which is then being channeled into more political ideology.
Yeah, and there's people like my last book, Hired, is kind of touches on this subject from a different angle, where I go to these places in Britain where it is kind of majority, apart from London, where one chapter's in London, where it is kind of majority kind of white working class communities, where they haven't been integrated into what Britain's become in the 21st century. And I don't mean in terms of multiculturalism, I just mean in terms of the modern economy. So you go to areas where, former industrial areas, where it wasn't just like the old jobs that went when the factories closed. It was kind of an entire culture kind of collapsed. So all of the institutional affiliations that were associated with the work, whether it's the trade unions, social clubs, even kind of even things like churches and organized religion and stuff, those kind of things that bind communities together have just collapsed, and it's not really been replaced with anything. So you just have people who, it was accepted when the mines and steelworks and whatever closed, they would never work again. Maybe their children wouldn't work either. You had successive governments which tried to kind of solve that problem by just kind of putting a retail park there or an Amazon warehouse there, which obviously didn't fix any of that stuff around community and integrating those people into what the economy is now, giving them education, skills and stuff. And you just have those pockets of resentment, and we still have that. Like today, you still see that. So with the riots last year, it wasn't in places where minority groups are not integrated into the mainstream society. It was areas that are predominantly white, where you have communities which aren't integrated into, you know, what the economy is now, at least in the southeast and more prosperous parts of the country. And I think that's a long-standing problem in not just the UK. You have it in America as well, and parts of Europe. And also what's made it much harder for the left in terms of why this stuff is manifesting in like this right-wing populism is ever since like the end of the 80s, well, end of the 70s, really, the left has kind of lost that kind of meta narrative to explain what's going on. Trade unions are kind of shells of what they used to be. So there's not really any movement to channel some of these grievances into something more positive. It just, you know, there are people who are looking for someone to blame and someone to follow, and then someone quite charismatic who's good on social media, whether it's Donald Trump or Nigel Farage, comes along and presents this compelling, like channels those grievances into a kind of a racist kind of subtext. And, you know, they're quite clever about how they do it now. So it isn't tarred with the kind of association with some of the very, you know, overt racism of the past, those movements.
And finally, just coming back to something that you touch on at the beginning of the book, where you're describing how your experience in the pickup sort of community and those nights out at the clubs. And you were saying that sort of as your life progressed, and I think as you went to university and you just started interacting with more women in perhaps more normal circumstances, not out at clubs and dressed up or whatever.
Sometimes still at clubs.
Yeah, but like that.
Not with
kind
a persona though.
Not with the persona, right? But that just showed you that gave you more confidence, and just actually interacting in kind of very real situations. In some ways was an antidote to feeling like you had to put on a persona or have, you know, all the game and know all of that stuff. And just to come back to this point about alienation and the left's response to why people are feeling this grievance, which is justified. You know, it's not justified if you're channeling that into racist ideology and rioting, but people feeling like our areas have been abandoned, we can barely make ends meet, no one really cares about us, it's all Westminster centric. Coming back to this point about real interactions, I mean, yes, you're going to get the charismatic figures that offer all these solutions and almost take people into a more psychological and emotional realm. But is part of the solution just really doing basic things to improve people's lives, so that if, you know, the bread and butter is in place, they might not be as swayed by somebody who's giving them some grand narrative or a vision or an ideology to follow. If there are local community hubs or places that you can actually interact and build that community again and have a sense of not being isolated, you know, to what extent do we need more big visions, or is it just practical solutions to help with people's lives?
Yeah, I mean, to answer the question like the wrong way round, in reverse order, I think, yeah, you do need technocratic solutions, but you also need a story. I mean, that's the problem that the Labour government has at the moment. It's pursuing like a technocratic approach, and if you look at some of the details of things they're doing, it's quite good. Like I think the thing they've done in terms of allowing councils to double council tax on second homes, for example, there are parts of the country that's having a big impact in terms of the money councils then have to like fix the local area, you know, fix the potholes, just fun local services and stuff. But you don't really hear about that because there's none of it's all very piecemeal. It's not part of this compelling story. But that also goes back to kind of the left kind of still working out what its role is now that you know, actually existing socialism of the past doesn't exist anymore. There's no industrial proletariat that's going to kind of come along and, you know, save us all. The left is still in this crisis mode and adjusting to a changed world. And I think there have been instances, you know, you've had politicians like Tony Blair who've tried to kind of forge this narrative of like, you know, a kind of progressive globalization, which, you know, it worked until for a while. You could say that worked until the 2008 crash, at least in terms of electorally. But it's kind of, it does, like people like Keir Starmer, it doesn't feel like there's a story behind any of it. So it doesn't really get everyone on board. It gets the policy wonks on board. But beyond that, there isn't really anything.
And that's the kind of irony with the Island of Strangers, set in an incorrect context, but put into a different context of an alienated society. That could actually, and how to fix that. and connect, grow connection again. That could be quite powerful, arguably.
Yeah, and it's the blame, the blame is always shifted on to kind of multiculturalism and these kind of first, second, third generation migrant communities not being integrated. And it's kind of, there's lots of people in the country who were born here, their parents were born here, their grandparents were born here, been here for many generations, and they're not integrated into society, not because of ethnicity, but because we have this lopsided economy where there are these huge pockets of deprivation, there is lots of alienation, there is a complete loss of public spaces. The only kind of profitable activity for the past several decades in Britain has been landlordism and buy-to-let, and not productive work. And Labour doesn't feel like they have a story about what kind of society they want to create. What kind of people do we want to reward in society? What kind of work do we want to reward? What do we want society to look like in the future? There isn't really. I know that there are kind of more immediate problems to fix, but some of these problems can't be fixed in the immediate term. It is a long-term thing. I feel fairly pessimistic because the populist right does have a story. It's one of resentment. It's one of kind of grievance and emotionally inflammatory, like anecdotes and whatever. But it's a story nonetheless, and that's why I think they're picking up kind of traction, particularly in this moment.
It's been really interesting to chat with you, James. As we say, Lost Boys is out now, and you also write regularly for Byline Times, particularly the print edition, which is available every month on subscription. And we really enjoy hosting your work in that too. So it's been really interesting to dissect this all with you.
Thanks for having me.